Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's online summit, AWS, What's New and What's Ahead. Today's event was organized by the hardworking folks at AWS Insider, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, NetApp, the company that brings enterprise-grade data services to the cloud and the simplicity and flexibility of the cloud into the data center for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends, and I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. For each of today's sessions, each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our very best to get to all of them. Our sponsor, NetApp, has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. And last but not least, at the end of the 3rd session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a pair of high-end Bose wireless noise-canceling headphones, but you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, What's New and Hot in AWS, a 60-minute insider look. For this session, we've called on Carlos Rivas, Senior Solutions Architect at Intervision Systems. Mr. Rivas is a senior solutions architect who has, over his 15-year career, worked with large telecom providers, managing and configuring network devices using a variety of tools and languages, including Java, Groovy, Python, Perl, and PHP. He's also a cloud computing instructor at LinkedIn Learning and Udacity. You are in for a great session. Take it away, Carlos.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and welcome everybody. We're in for a good one today. I usually really like anything that has to do with what's new and what's ahead in AWS, simply because Amazon just pushes new features, pretty much like 3 or 4 features every single day. That's a mind-boggling pace that they have to keep there. So yeah, I decided to pick for you a series of what I consider, something that's really hot right now that can be very, very useful to you, as well as some what's new, something, not everything is going to be relevant to you, but, if you stick around, you're going to probably find a few gold nuggets here and there that are going to probably help you in what you're doing right now. Before we move on, there's my LinkedIn, so feel free to connect. I'm always more than happy to share and answer your questions around DevOps, cloud computing in general, and as an instructor myself, like I said, I'm always very, very happy to help you out. So as I mentioned, we're going to cover in the what's hot. We're going to talk about infrastructure as code. We're going to talk about software development trends using AWS. We're going to talk about things that can help you with your DevOps or CI/CD pipelines. When it comes to what's new, I also found things in infrastructure as code, as well as machine learning, so be sure to stick around for that. So let's start right away with what's hot. Let me clarify what do I mean by hot. It's things that are not necessarily new, nothing that's been released like in the past months or the past few weeks or anything like that, but things that are like really trending and are very useful, at least for some of you here in the audience. So with that, let's jump in right away. So AWS Step Functions, they just released a feature to allow it to access over 200 AWS services. So what exactly is AWS Step Functions? So let's have a conversation about that. It's a way to access those services, those 200 plus services I just mentioned. It's a way to access them without the need to write code. This is really important. Essentially, you use a visual environment and just write some JSON code. I'm calling it code, but it's really just a text file formatted as a JavaScript notation document. And what you can do with this is create workflows, essentially. So if something happens, you can say, hey, we have a new file came into our storage. What can we do with this file? And then you can use step functions to say, well, I want this file to be converted to this other format, or I need this file to be passed through a machine learning algorithm. And you can do all of that using step functions without having the need for software development skills. So, like I said, this is one of those technologies. It's been around for a while in AWS. It's not new, but it's very hot, and now it's getting very, very useful to you. This is one of those workflows, and this is what it looks like. You will essentially have this when you're developing AWS step functions. You'll have this side by side, and you'll be able to see exactly what you're doing in a visual way. This is great because what this means is you could have, you could go for lunch with your tech guy, and just in the back of a napkin, just using a pen or something, you can do a diagram like this and say, hey, this is what we're doing, and this is what I want it to look like. And just taking this diagram visually back to the computer, you could turn this into something useful, This would be a great starting point. The one that we're looking at as an example here is a CI/CD pipeline, so this is more DevOps related. But as I just mentioned, you can access over 200 AWS services to get what you need done properly. In fact, if that's not enough for you, you can call AWS Lambda and then actually have custom code executed by a step function. So you could even interface with actual software developers without having the need to code. Just tell them, hey, go ahead and code an AWS Lambda function for me, and I'm going to call it from AWS functions. So moving on here, this is what it looks like in the back end. So if I go back one slide, this is, like I said, a visual representation of a JSON document. And behind that graphic, it will look something like this. You will just say, I have this state, which is one of the little steps in the diagram. And in this case, the type is a task. And it's going to be calling a Lambda function that is going to do something. When that Lambda function finishes doing whatever functionality you require, it has a next, which means it will go to this or that step right then and there after the execution. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's talk about, this one is interesting, and this one is more infrastructure related, and it's probably going to be very, very useful to some of you because this is managing container deployments. In this case, in particular, we're going to be talking about Kubernetes. So imagine that you have a Kubernetes cluster, and it is exposed to the public because it's a web application. And you're saying, hey, how can I protect my Kubernetes cluster with a firewall, right? Now you have that capability. Now you can use the Web Access Firewall, which is a service provided by AWS, to protect your Kubernetes cluster. Now, there's a little change. It's not as simple as you just turn it on and you're done. You're going to need a load balancer controller, which is a special kind of Kubernetes controller you can deploy within your cluster. And what that's going to allow you to do is connect it to standard AWS load balancer, right? And once you do that, of course, in front of your load balancer, you can go ahead and throw the actual Web Access Firewall, which you can then use to mitigate any issues, happening with your cluster, such as denial of service attacks or just getting spammed by bots or something like that. And, overall protect your application and keep it running in the cloud. This is what the architecture is going to look like. On the left, you have the standard Kubernetes cluster that's going to be running your application. It's going to have databases. It's going to have those little pods with your microservices. And then there's going to be the load balancer controller, which is going to be a component that talks to an actual AWS application load balancer in this case. And once you have that application load balancer, the next step is, like I said, no problem there. Just throw in the standard AWS Web Access Firewall service, and you should be good to go there. Once you have the Web Access Firewall in front of your cluster, then you will proceed to implement Web Access Firewall rules. Those rules are what you can use to just overall say, I want to block this range. For example, if you're getting attacked from a certain IP range, from a certain geographic part of the world, you can just block the entire subnet, for example, the entire block of IPs, and that would essentially kill the attack right then and there. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. This is a great tool if you're exposing microservices to the world. This is something that you can use to, protect your environment and keep your application running without incurring in, auto-scaling costs and all kinds of things that happen when you're getting attacked with something like a denial of service attack. So moving on to something slightly different and back to software development, AWS Lambda function is now powered by AWS Gravitron 2 processors. Let me explain what this means. You're going to get a 34% better price performance overall. What that means is it's going to be about 20% cheaper, and you're going to get about 20% overall better performance. This is really, really important because Lambda functions are measured in milliseconds, I believe. So you pay by execution time. So of course, if the machine runs your Lambda functions a lot faster, that automatically implies that you're going to be paying a lot less. Now, for those of you that don't know what an AWS Lambda function is, it's essentially a piece of code, part of your overall cloud deployment. And this piece of code is going to execute on Amazon-provided infrastructure. What this means is you don't need to worry about servers. You don't need to worry about patching operating systems. You don't need to worry about scaling. Basically, there's no worries. You just concentrate on writing your business logic, your code, essentially. And then once this code is out there, it just runs on AWS-provided infrastructure. This is very, very popular, especially for DevOps type of operations, such as monitoring and generating alarms and overall maintenance of your infrastructure. Like moving log files or clearing servers or restarting something. These are Lambda is great for those little tasks that would otherwise require a person to log in and do something. So you can actually do all those things in an automated fashion. Lambda is also great at functionality triggers. Going back to the one that I mentioned for step functions, which was receiving a file. Let's say that somebody uploaded a file to your S3 bucket. You can trigger a Lambda function that's going to do some functionality for you. Let's say that this file is a text file and it has a certain record structure, and you want this data to be imported into, say, a database. You would trigger a Lambda function that says, hey, we have this text file that just came in. Let's go ahead and send the file to this Amazon glue process or something like that is going to do the standard ETL, extract, transform, and load. And this is a great starting point. So yeah, if you have access to software developers that have some cloud experience, just letting them know that, hey, Lambda is really cheap and we don't have to worry about servers. This is a great use of AWS. This is pretty much an example of that architecture I just described. Going to the left here, you would see something like CloudFront access logs. Let's say, your website's access logs, and you want to mine that data to determine, where are my visitors coming from? What are they doing? How long are they staying on my website? You can gather those logs and send it to a Lambda. That Lambda can send that to a text processing functionality, such as Amazon Kinesis in this particular example. And then you end up with another storage bucket with the logs that have been processed and analyzed. From there, you can generate analytics. You can partition the data and send it to an Amazon DynamoDB, for example. Or you can use another service like Amazon Athena, which is a service that allows you to run SQL type of queries over text files, which is really, really nice. So if you have a bunch of text files and you want to use them as if they were a database, you can use a service like Amazon Athena in this case. What else? Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention Amazon Kinesis right here for analytics, which is essentially a way to take that data that you just processed and turn it into something that's, a little bit more useful. Because, once you collect the data, let's say that you want to group that data by country, for example, which is a little bit hard because you would need to take each IP address and then run it through a geo-IP process to map it to a certain geographic area. You could do that with an analytical tool, something like Amazon Kinesis in this case. So if you haven't paid attention to Lambda, please do. It's getting cheaper, it's getting faster, and it's a really, really useful tool if you want to avoid the use of servers. So moving on to something different and back to the world of infrastructure, I was looking at Amazon Quick Starts, which I'll explain what that is in a minute, and I found this architecture where they have it there available to you guys. And this is something that I talk about a lot in this summits, and it's the reference architecture or the well-architected framework. In this case in particular, I'm going to be talking about the HIPAA compliance. So, let's say that you just sign up for AWS and you have sensitive medical data or something similar along those lines. What can you do to make sure that every server and everything is protected, and you start with a solid foundation that complies with HIPAA regulation? Actually, I'm going to show you the architecture, and we're going to discuss it here. So here it is. You start at the outer layer with AWS Cloud. That's kind of important to mention that it is AWS Cloud, because not every service that you're going to use within AWS is going to be HIPAA compliant. So you need to be sure that you're using the AWS service that already passed that certification. In this case, it's no big deal because every service that you see in this diagram already has that certification, so you're good there. But let's take a look. And I like this one in particular because it's just a single AWS account. So this is not like something like enterprise grade. This would be something like for a small type of business where you have a single AWS account and you have various VPCs. For example, you have a management VPC, a production VPC, a development VPC. And if you can see here, the one that says management has a couple of NAT gateways. Those are network address translators. And what they do is they provide outbound internet access for your production and development VPCs. What that means is your production machines or your development machines are never going to be exposed to the outside world. In this setup, they will never even have a public IP, so there's no way to access these machines from the outside world. So again, we're talking about HIPAA compliance here, so you want to make sure that you don't have public IPs exposed, for potential, ransomware or denial of service attacks or those things. So the center of this environment is the transit gateway at the bottom, which what it does is essentially manage traffic across the various VPCs. And if you don't know, a VPC is essentially a virtual private cloud. So essentially a little network that is isolated from the rest. So you need components like the transit gateway to be able to talk back and forth across these networks. Otherwise, they will be completely isolated. So that may be okay if you're just moving to the cloud for the sake of having an extension to your data center. You may not need the management VPC at all in this case because you don't want to be exposed to the internet unless you actually have to be, in the case like if you have a website that's facing the public, for example. So in this case, you have your production workloads that may or may not be able to talk to the development VPC. That's really up to you. And you have your transit gateway that controls that flow. And like I said, if any of those machines requires outbound internet access, you have that management VPC with the NAT gateways pointing to the outside world. Now, one component that I want to point you to is the flow logs. That's probably a mandatory requirement for HIPAA compliance. What that is a trace of every network packet coming and going out of this particular VPCs. So the flow logs are going to allow you to capture this data and send it to one of those tools that allow you to, intrusion detection, for example, something that can react to events, right? And speaking of events, if we move over to the right, you'll see that it says login and audit controls, where we have CloudWatch, AWS config, and CloudTrail. Let's talk about those. CloudTrail is also a mandatory requirement for HIPAA compliance, which is the audit trail. It's like what happened in the environment and who did it and when they did it. That's where you're going to find it in an audit trail. So that's always going to be there. AWS config is a tool that looks at that audit trail I just mentioned, and it will find any and all changes to your infrastructure. So if a server goes offline, you will find out about it thanks to AWS config. If a new server comes online, which is something that you would find if somebody breaks into your environment, they'll probably try to spin up new servers to do some damage or mine cryptocurrency or something like that. AWS config will pick up on that right away. And of course, you have something like CloudWatch, which is going to be for overall traditional monitoring, and also for just collecting logs, your application logs. This is where you would go for your standard run-of-the-mill, where are my log files and what is my application doing at this time. Now, with all these services running, at the very bottom, you have SNS and IAM, which IAM you're going to use for managing your identities, and SNS is to receive notifications through email or to your phone in case any of these events that I just mentioned actually happen. Again, these are kind of mandatory requirements if you're implementing an actual HIPAA architecture such as this one. But just know that you don't need to spend, thousands of dollars and having a huge AWS infrastructure. All this that you're looking at right here can be done in a single AWS account. So if you're listening to this and you're new to the cloud, or you're a software developer trying to grow your resume, you can actually deploy this entire architecture. It's not going to cost you more than a few dollars in your environment, and this will look great in your resume if you can do something like this as infrastructure as code and be able to speak to it and in a confident way. Just people love that, knowing that you have an understanding of how to protect information in the cloud. So I could speak all day about HIPAA compliance here and this particular infrastructure, but I'm just going to say one more thing before we move on. There's something here that says customer connectivity, where you see a VPN and you also see Direct Connect. Direct Connect, of course, is going to be more enterprise grade. If you want to connect this cloud to your data center, you will probably use a service like Direct Connect. And if you're just testing this out and you just want to do it at home or something like that, you can use a site-to-site VPN, which is significantly cheaper. And a VPN is good practice. Again, like I said, if you're doing this to pad your resume and increase your understanding of the cloud, it would be great if you are able to set up a VPN and connect it to infrastructure like this, because that's what you will use to encrypt traffic back and forth to, let's say, from your home or from your on-premise network to the cloud. You would certainly set up a VPN, a Direct Connect, or both. So, yeah, let's move on from this, but just know that you can deploy this with the CloudFormation that's provided for free in AWS QuickStarts, which we're going to talk about here pretty soon. Another thing I found in AWS QuickStarts is the EC2 Instance Scheduler. This is something that's hot right now, but it's not brand new. It's been around for a while. They just keep making it better and better because people just love this tool. This is a really, really great tool to manage costs in the cloud. Let's take a look at the architecture so I can explain to you what this is. The EC2 Instance Scheduler is essentially a Lambda function, just a little bit piece of code, that is going to check your environment, especially looking for resources such as EC2 machines, whether they're Linux servers or Windows servers, and also it's going to take a look at your Amazon RDS databases if you have any. Now, what is the goal here? Imagine that you're running several environments. You have a production environment, and you also have one or more development environments. Perhaps you also have a test environment. So keep in mind what I just said. Let's say that you need 6 servers for production. And you also need 6 servers for the test environment because you want to make it as identical to the production environment as possible for the sake of realistic testing, right? And you have an environment for the developers to play with. So as you can see, if you started with 6 servers, now you need another 6, now you need another 6. All of a sudden, you're running 20 or 30 machines in AWS, and you go from a few $100s now to a few $1,000s a month in expenses. But then you realize, wait a minute, the test environment and the development environment is never used outside of business hours. So why am I paying for these machines to run 24/7 if I can just run these machines from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, right? This is when this tool, the EC2 Instance Scheduler, comes in. You can automatically save 60% cost by turning off those machines for 2/3 of the day, pretty much. Like, just run them for 8 hours if they're only used for 8 hours. And the way to do this is by using this tool. You will set it up. And by the way, all the stuff is free, is provided to you. So you just need to go in there and set it up. They provide an implementation guide on how to use this. So like I said, I'll show you the AWS Quick Start here in a second. And once you have this tool running, essentially all you need to do is identify which machines are production, which machines are tests, which machines are development. And this tool will take it from there. It will say, okay, these machines are on this schedule, and they need to be shut off at 5 p.m., every weekday. And they need to be turned on, every weekday at 8 o'clock in the morning, for example. And you can absolutely do that, and you will not be paying all that money for machines that are not used outside of business hours. So that's why this software is quite hot. And like I said, it's free. It's something that you can certainly take advantage of. This is how you set it up. It's really, really simple. You would just add a few tags to your machines. For example, let's say this machine is, a development server. You would set a tag, and you would call this tag, for example, a schedule. And you would set it to a value, in this case, office hours. And this value, office hours, is defined in the configuration of the EC2 Instance Scheduler. So what's going to happen there is that it's going to say, okay, what is the meaning of office hours? And in there, you're going to have a definition for office hours. Let's say you call it 9 to 5. And then the Lambda function, which is going to execute every 5 minutes, is going to say, okay, this machine needs to run only during office hours. And there's a logic in there in the Lambda function that says, are we inside office hours right now? Yes or no? And if it's no, it will send a stop command to the server. So it will not delete the server or anything like that. It will just power the server down. When the server is powered down, of course, you're not being charged for it. So that's where your savings come in, for example. And from there, like I said, the Lambda function will run every 5 minutes forever. And then when office hours come in around again, it will send the machine start command. So by the time everybody comes back into the office the next day, the machines will be running as if nothing happened. So again, really great tool, and it's absolutely free for you to use within your AWS environment. Now, I've been mentioning AWS Quick Starts now for the last two features. So let's talk about what it is. It's a way to easily deploy infrastructure. Emphasis on the word easy. It's not necessarily like one click. They try to make it look like it's one click, but it's not. It's essentially a catalog of solutions like the HIPAA infrastructure I just showed you, or the EC2 Instance Scheduler. And these solutions are going to be available to you in the form of an implementation guide, a pricing guide as well. And you can take these tools. They're available at this page. And by the way, this is not a typo. The name of the product is AWS Quick Starts in plural, but the URL to it is in singular. So aws.amazon.com/quickstart without the S. There's just a collection of CloudFormation scripts in there that you can take for free and deploy into your environment. And it would include a series of solutions like the one we just saw. Just keep in mind that it's not something that is like, oh, this is just right there. I just do one click and it deploys. No.
every one of these has some assumptions about your environment, so you need to make sure to read the implementation guide of everything that you want to deploy before you go ahead and do it. But just know that this can save you a ton of time, because all these are solutions that already follow best practices. They're already there for you to take advantage of. So just something to keep in mind. Now we'll switch gear to what's new. These are the things that I found in AWS that are just coming around just now. Although this isn't really a great time to talk about what's new, because AWS reInvent is coming in a few weeks, I believe about 4 or 5 weeks from now. And that's where they really release all the latest and greatest. So right now, they're pretty conservative around this time of year, because they're saving the good stuff for the next 30 days or so. But with that, let's switch to what's new. The first one that I have here is AWS CloudFormation retry failure. To me, this is great. I mean, this is something that will save you a ton of headaches, especially when troubleshooting. If you're new to CloudFormation, you'll understand what I'm talking about, because you have these deployments. You deploy something. It takes 15, 20 minutes to deploy. And then on the very last line of your code, something fails, something crashes, and CloudFormation by default will start rolling back the changes you just did. And that's like really annoying. That's like, oh my God, I just made a little typo, and now I need to wait another 20 or 30 minutes for this thing to deploy again. It's just horrible. Now you can just do a retry, a stack from the point of failure. This is like really amazing. You can just run your thing. It will fail at some point, and then, okay, now I can take a look at this thing, and let's find out what the failure is, and then I can probably resume from the point of failure. This is like it's a tiny little feature, but it saves you a ton of time. This is more or less what it looks like. Let's say that you're running your CloudFormation script, you're deploying servers, you're making changes, and all of a sudden you have a create fail in your log file. And then you realize, oh, no, it was something simple. I just forgot to create this other resource that needed to be available prior to me executing this CloudFormation, or I forgot the name of this resource. So now it's saying resource not found or something like that. Like, what do? Do I have to run this thing again from the get-go, which is really, really annoying. And now with this little feature, you don't have to do this anymore. It's going to be something like this. You're going to get that failure. But now you have the option of retry instead of just automatically rolling back. So in this case, you would be stuck in this screen. You would go behind the scenes and say, maybe this thing is missing that bucket, or I mistyped the name of that bucket. Let me go ahead and make sure that everything is in place and everything is looking good. And then you can come back to this screen and click on retry and just overall move on from there, and not have to wait from the whole thing to create all over again. So it's a tiny little feature, but it saves you a ton of time if you use CloudFormation. Now, this is a brand new release. I believe this has not been available, not as a general availability release up to this point. Is the AWS Cloud Control API. This only really has meaning for those of you that create third-party software that interfaces with AWS. But yeah, this is going to make your life so much easier, because what this does is it's essentially a standard way to accessing AWS resources from outside AWS. One example that I have right here is the get resource command. So in the past, if you wanted to pull information on a VPC, you have to go to the VPC APIs and find out, okay, how do I get this data from this VPC, and then learn all the anything that has to do with it. You have to learn it. Okay, now I want to do Windows Server, so you have to learn everything about Windows servers, and so on and so forth. But now with the standard interface, you can just do a single command that says get resource, and then you can specify something that says, okay, what kind of resource? Oh, it's a VPC. Oh, it's a Windows server. And you can just use this standard command over and over that you can probably memorize and get really good at it without having to learn like 50 different little commands to get the data that you need. So again, this is a pretty niche one because this only applies if you're creating software that interfaces with AWS. I've done it myself once because I had a customer ask me, hey, can you do a piece of software? It was a little Python script that would interface with AWS. It will create a virtual private cloud. It will create the VPN connection back to their data center. And all this was done through a little Python script. So if I had to do that all over again, it would be a lot easier using this Cloud Control API because it would be a more predictable way of doing things instead of having to guess and read, 600 pages of a PDF just to find what you need, right? So, moving on from the Cloud Control API, let's talk about TextRack. There's some updates around TextRack. I actually have a course that I made available on LinkedIn Learning about creating an expense tracker using TextRack, which is essentially a way to pass Amazon a graphic, and this graphic is going to have text. So essentially documents that you scan or documents that you take a picture of with your phone. And TextRack, what it does is it will search this graphic visually, and it will extract the text for you and give it back to you in a text format. So great tool. They're updating it. The highlight that I want to show you here is the one that says 50% reduction in asynchronous job processing times. So essentially what this means is, well, of course, it means that it's 50% cheaper, but it's kind of my way of telling you, go ahead and use this tool in a batch processing type of format, meaning that you would have a bucket, and in that bucket, you will put in all your graphics. Let's say that you scan a document and there's 600 pages, and these 600 pages are in a visual format that you cannot analyze. Let's say JPEGs, for example. You would have this 600 JPEGs in there. You can call TextRack, and now it will cost you, half. That's really, really huge, especially for people that, that are processing legacy documents. Let's say that you have thousands of pages of paper forms filled by your customers, and you need to turn them into usable text that you can analyze. This tool will help you with that. And this tool is great because it's not just brute force OCR, optical character recognition. It actually detects the layout of the document, and it will group the information in a meaningful way. So just keep that in mind. It's not just blindly doing an optical character recognition that is going to put you in a spot where you have to do a lot of work just to understand what's going on. This is what that architecture looks like. It's essentially kind of like what I mentioned. You will have a bucket, and the document will go in there, and then you can use that bucket as a way to say, okay, new file came into the bucket. Let's call Amazon TextRack, and that's going to do a start document API call. And in the end, what you do is you get a document, a JSON type of document from TextRack, and that's going to contain the translation, I should say, from graphic to text of whatever text was found in that document. So from there, you can do, your analysis. You can run your custom lambdas or whatever you need to do to turn that into useful information for you. So great update, another great tool that you want to keep an eye on if you do any kind of document processing in the cloud. Now, this is another one that I found along the same lines of machine learning. It's the well-architected framework machine learning lens. They came up with this thing. It's essentially a white paper that tells you, best practices to follow when deploying machine learning solutions in AWS. Let's take a look here. It's a document that's going to give you, like I said, the best practices and an overall architecture principles when you're designing machine learning workloads in the cloud. So what that means is, let's say you want to do a certain machine learning analysis, and you want to use a tool that, like TextRack, for example, finding text in graphics, or using machine learning vision to find certain objects in videos, for example, and it will tell you what's the best practices to follow to deploy the solution. Because something that people don't know is that machine learning is not just a tool that you use. really the tough part about machine learning is framing the problem itself. That's really where the key is. It's like, what do I need to do to understand what is it that I'm trying to get out of all this data, right? Once you understand your problem, then it goes to data processing. Like, okay, do I need to convert graphics to text? Do I need to pull log files from somewhere? Where is my data coming from? Once you have all this data, then your job is essentially to develop a model. And that model, you're going to teach this model, hey, this data is fraud. This data is legitimate. And, you train a machine learning model to be able to identify whatever it is that you're looking for, and you go ahead and deploy that. Once you deploy that, just like in any DevOps situation, you go to monitoring and measuring. Like, is it something that I'm doing actually meeting my business goals, or is it not? And based on feedback from the business, you can go ahead and tweak your original problem and go through the whole thing all over again. That's essentially how you do machine learning. So really the hard part is framing the problem. Just keep that in mind. It's not about the latest technology. It's not about the greatest tool. It's just about properly framing what it is that you're looking for in your data. And now, of course, this white paper will take care of the best practices for you when it comes to deploying the solution, because AWS has all these various services around machine learning. Now, this one, again, is a little bit niche, but I found it to be pretty cool, which is AWS Marketplace deployment. The AWS Marketplace is where you go to buy pre-made solutions that you can deploy in your environment, such as I need a firewall, so you just pay for the firewall, right? You're not going to make your developers code a firewall. So you just, let's say that I need a Palo Alto Networks firewall. I would just go ahead and buy one, right? You're not going to write one from scratch. And that's the kind of things that you find in the marketplace. Well, now, if you have a solution that you want to sell to other people, you can directly from your CI/CD pipeline, you can deploy to marketplace, which is really, really cool for those that have a business creating solutions for others. For me as a consultant, this is something that I should consider. Instead of rewriting everything from scratch every single time, I could, go ahead and create something in a CI/CD pipeline using standard AWS tools and have the thing just deploy automatically to marketplace. And whenever I get a new client, I can tell them, hey, just go ahead and download my solution there. You can even pay me through the AWS Marketplace, and it's pretty much everything is seamless. I wouldn't have to worry about anything. Again, I know this is a little bit niche tool that may not apply to most of you, but if you're selling services to AWS, this is something to consider. And that's what I have for you today. It's an ever-evolving thing. AWS always has tons and tons of features, all coming all the time. So stay tuned. If I come back here in 5 weeks or so, I'm going to have a lot to talk about, because it's going to be AWS reInvent, and there's going to be a ton of new features coming out. So with that, I would love to take your questions.
Thanks, Carlos. Let's see here. We'll get to our questions now, but I just want to remind attendees that you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. I guess I'll just take it from the top here. What's the hottest AWS machine learning service right now?
Oh, that is a great question. I would say when it comes to machine learning, that would be SageMaker, which is the AWS machine learning service that is pretty generic, meaning that it applies to a lot of people. So you can use it for various problems, regardless of the business domain. So you can use that a lot. So that's if I wanted to start, that's probably not the easiest way to start, because it's a fairly complex tool. But yeah, that would be my recommendation there.
Okay, here's one. If I want to build a third-party app for AWS, what's a good starting point?
In that case, I would recommend a tool such as AWS EventBridge. The EventBridge is a tool that is going to monitor every single event that happens in the cloud, like a server spinning up or a server spinning down. And this is a tool that is currently used by a lot of third-party vendors, such as Datadog and New Relic and all those people that create monitoring tools, because you can essentially monitor everything that's happening through that tool and just create triggers that can react to those actions, and essentially you can create software that pretty much interfaces with AWS. Of course, you would take advantage also of the AWS Control API that I just mentioned. So combining that with EventBridge is a great solution.
Fascinating. Okay, let's see. Here's one. I have a custom web application. How can I ensure it meets the best practices of the well-architected framework?
Yeah, that's absolutely great to have, because once you have your application deployed, it's like you're wondering, okay, am I doing the right thing? Well, the best way to do that is to just go to the AWS white papers, and in there you're going to find a lot of PDF files that tells you how to do things, how to react to certain type of situations, especially DDoS attacks or ransomware attacks. There's going to be all kinds of information in there, and that's based on experience, based on things that has actually happened in the past. So you can be sure that if your application is more or less in line with those principles, you should be good to go. It should be a no-brainer there, that whether you're meeting those requirements or not.
Okay, gotcha. Here's a quick one. Is the AWS CDK similar to Terraform?
That's a great question, because Terraform is taking a lot of ground these days, especially because it's very popular in Microsoft Azure, but they do have an AWS provider in there that can help you with AWS as well. I personally use Terraform, so it's a great tool, and I'm happy with it. But the CDK is like right there. That AWS Cloud Development Kit is a tool that is right there, and it's evolving very, very quickly. So if you're a person that works exclusively in AWS and you have no interest in moving to other clouds such as Microsoft Azure, then you can certainly take advantage of the CDK. But if you're a multi-cloud person like myself, yeah, probably Terraform is a better solution in that case.
That's fascinating. So, okay, here's another one. Which languages are supported by the AWS CDK?
Let's see. Java for sure. TypeScript is the one that Amazon pushes the most. Python for sure as well. Those are the ones that I remember. I believe C#.NET it's also in there. But yeah, those are the most popular. If I had to choose to start, it would be probably TypeScript, which is essentially a variation of JavaScript.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Looks like we've got one more question here. Can I use Lambda functions as a server replacement?
That's a great question. Let's see. It really depends on the functionality. A Lambda function is not meant to be something that runs 24 hours a day, listening in a port, waiting for people to come in. So in that particular architecture, I would have to say no. Something like a web server that's always listening, always waiting for traffic to come in, I would say don't use a Lambda in that particular situation. A Lambda is more for a point-specific task. Like, hey, I need to run something, and it might take a few seconds. You don't want something that is like long-lived. I believe the longest running time for a Lambda function is like 15 minutes or something like that. So you shouldn't expect the Lambda function to be a long-lived process. In that case, a standard Linux server or Windows server is a much more appropriate solution there.
Gotcha. Okay, well, it looks like that's all the questions we have for this session. I want to thank Carlos Rivas for a great session. We're going to take a short break now, but we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session, what's coming and best practices for AWS security and backup and recovery. Carlos Rivas will be back with us to lead that session, which will be moderated by my colleague, David Rammel, the driving force behind the technology editorial juggernaut that is Virtualization and Cloud Review. Thanks again to our sponsor, NetApp, the company that brings enterprise-grade data services to the cloud and the simplicity and flexibility of the cloud into the data center for making this event possible. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsor. And remember, during today's third session, we will be giving away a pair of high-end Bose wireless noise-canceling headphones, but you must be present to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, NetApp for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called What's Coming in Best Practices for AWS Security and Backup and Recovery. I'd like to welcome back a man who literally needs no introduction because you've been listening to him for the past hour, Carlos Rivas. Carlos, we're all ready for part two. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, David. It's glad to be back for this session. And this is going to be very similar. If you were here in my previous session, it's going to be very similar. But in this case, we're going to try to keep it specific as much as possible when it comes to the areas of protecting your information, whether it's disaster recovery or backups or storage, something along those lines. So it's going to be centered about what's hot and what's new, but, in a more specific kind of way. As always, here's my information regarding LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with me. I'm more than happy to answer your questions about, DevOps and cloud architecture. And I'm a LinkedIn learning instructor, so I really love talking to you guys and answering your questions and helping people in general. So with that out of the way, let's see what we have in the world of disaster recovery and backups. So we're going to be talking about, as I mentioned, what's hot and what's new. And what I'm limiting is, I found certain tools such as Cloud Endure, like what's new in that area. AWS Backup, which is a really hot service at the moment, like what's new in that particular area. And, storage in general. So, without much delay, let's jump right into it. So a brand new feature for AWS Backup as of right now is the Audit Manager. It sounds very simple and boring, but let me tell you that something that it's not as simple as just, I need to make a backup. Well, sometimes you need to make a backup, but you also need to apply data retention rules for regulatory needs. For example, I have customers that they need to retain log files and network activity up to 5 years in their backups, and they needed to comply with government regulations. So a tool like AWS Backup's Audit Manager is great because it saves time to those auditors that are going to come in and make sure that they're doing things the right way. Because a tool like this is certainly going to help you say, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what it looks like in a summarized type of way. So you're not really guessing like, let me go to S3. Let's see when was the last time that I did a backup, or let's see if we meet this requirement. Is the backup? Is there a possibility that this backup could be tampered with? So all those things you can monitor from a single dashboard using the Audit Managers. It's a great tool for that reason if you need to have regulatory requirements that your data needs to meet, especially those backups. It will look something like this. You will go into the AWS backup, and you have to establish what they call a framework. A framework is essentially a way to monitor your controls in general. As I mentioned, you have to meet certain data retention requirements. Or, for example, this data needs to be backed up, and I need to be sure that there's no way to tamper with this data once I back it up to this particular location, let's say cold storage. Let's say that you have 100 terabytes of data that is stored in AWS just for that reason. You can enable a setting that would say this data cannot and will not be tampered with. So in that particular scenario, you would set up something
from this point of view. And once you lock that data, there is no way to, make any changes to it in any way, shape, or form. And you would do this, by following a certain AWS backup frameworks, for example. Moving on, there's also the possibility of using service control policies in the same tool, AWS Backups. But before I explain to you, what's the benefit here, I have to explain what a service control policy is. So imagine that you have an AWS organization, and of course, if you're using a tool like AWS Backups, you probably have a fairly large AWS deployment. You don't have like a single account, little type of deployment, because in that case, you're probably going to be using a different tool, such as the AWS EBS Volume Lifecycle Manager or something smaller than that. If you're using AWS Backup, like I said, you probably have an AWS organization that looks something like this, where you have a root or master account. And then below that, you have several organizations such as shared services, development, and production. And you will have various accounts for several reasons under those organizational units. Now, what is a service control policy? Essentially, it's something that you deploy at the top level, at your root organization level. And those will trickle down to your various organizational units. So, for example, if you want to say, I want to force everybody to have to change their passwords, whether they want to or not, every 90 days, for example, you can write that as a service control policy. And even if new accounts come into your environment, let's say new development environments, for example, they will receive this service control policy that is being trickled down from the very top. So, yeah, it's a great tool that can help you in that sense to, trickle down rules and regulations that you may have for your entire AWS environment, so that you don't have to worry about, is this account compliant? What are the developers doing? Are they, following the rules? If you enforce the rules from the top level down, you're not going to have to worry about that. Now, imagine if we're talking about AWS backup in that sense, it would be the very same thing. You have an AWS organization at the top, you have your service control policies, and you're going to be using AWS backups in some of those accounts. Chances are, at least all the production accounts are going to be using AWS backups for obvious reasons in that case. Now, so let's say, for example, I was mentioning the ability to lock a backup to make sure it's tamper-proof. You would put that in a service control policy at the top level of your organization, so that you can pass it down and have it take effect down there in the lower environments, whether it's production or development or something like that. But you get to control this from a single location. So, like I said, you can create those policies at the top level. It will pass down to your member accounts. And then, anything that has to do with backups will inherit those SCPs from the very top. Now, what use cases can you implement in this case? Well, the number one is limit access to those backups. For example, once a backup is created, you can say, well, nobody can read it unless they have an administration level to the account, and they will not even be able to retrieve that data ever again. You can limit the tags. There's nothing more annoying than having users in the lower level environments mess with the tags of the backup. For example, if a backup belongs to a Windows server and somebody puts a tag in there that says, hey, this is a Linux server, like, okay, there's no way to know anymore. Now somebody changed the tag. This isn't great. So you can make sure that those tags match the original server, and then limit the access of who can change that or tamper with these things. Because, you may need to add a tag that say, hey, this backup was taken by this person on this day, and you might want to put that in a tag for quick reference. So you may have some people that have access to changing tags on those backups, but, not allow everybody, for example. Another use case for SCPs and within AWS backups is to restrict access to any admin level features. What I mean by this is to be able to disable functionalities within AWS Backup. You don't want everybody to have the ability to change anything at the top level, right? So even if they're an admin themselves, they shouldn't be able to change like really critical functionality. Like, I want this backup to be unencrypted. Like, why? Why would you want the backup to be unencrypted? So you might be able to do it, but you will have to go through a different account or get some management approval or something. You should not let that just randomly happen for whatever reason. Right? It's not something that you want to have everybody to be able to do. And like I said, if you have an organization with tons and tons of AWS accounts, you may want to control this with service control policies from the very top. Moving on from AWS Backup for a moment, let's talk about Cloud Endure. Cloud Endure is a great tool when it comes to data migration to AWS. I've done projects entirely based on Cloud Endure, and that's really the goal of a tool like this, is to be able to use it like end-to-end. Like, you have this 10 servers in your on-prem environment, and you need these 10 servers to now be in the cloud. You can develop an entire project just for this using this one tool and one tool only, which is Cloud Endure. But I just mentioned data migration. People don't realize that you can use Cloud Endure also for disaster recovery. So, and that's one of those things that's where it shines, right? You can just continue that migration process indefinitely and use it as a disaster recovery tool. Not only that, but Cloud Endure is also a tool that can help you in the sense of cloud to cloud or region to region within AWS. So it's not only for on-prem servers that you need to move to the cloud. You can, if your servers are already in AWS, you can still use this tool. So keep that in mind. This is more or less what that will look like. Let's go over this in detail here. So you have on the very left, you have the Cloud Endure agent, which is a little software that runs on your target machines, on the machines that you're intending to migrate. Whether, like I said, they could be already in the cloud, they could be on-prem, they could be in a different cloud provider. So what this tool is going to do is going to look for any changes in the storage of these machines, like sector by sector, looking at the hard drive, looking at data that's changing, what they call it block level data. So they don't really care whether it's a database or an operating system. Any changes to the storage of these machines, it's going to get replicated to your target environment right away. Now, what happens then? Well, there's what do you call it, a Cloud Endure console that keeps track to make sure the agents are running, make sure this replication is running all the time. And then this data is being collected in AWS in the form of EBS volumes. And then at some point in time, you can say, well, I want to see how the migration is going. So you can do what is known as stage deployment, where you're not going to have a cutoff. You're not going to turn off your original servers, right? You're just going to do a little deployment to make sure that everything is working. And you can launch those EC2 and make sure everything is working and test everything and say, oh, this migration stuff actually works. And once you're happy with that, you can cut off the main servers, and then from there on continue to use the newly migrated servers. So the question now is, what if I want to do a continuous replication, like just do it forever? I don't need to stop doing this data replication. I can just keep going on and on and on forever, to the point where, okay, now I had a disaster occurred in my data center or in the other region in the cloud. And now is when I can say, okay, let's use this real life situation of a cutoff to switch to the other environment. And you can totally do that. So this tool is meant for these two purposes. One of them being, like I said, data migration, when you do a cutoff and then you stop right there and then you just continue to use the migrated servers. Or you can just replicate your data forever and ever, and that is considered a disaster recovery scenario. And this tool is absolutely great for this. So just something for you to keep in mind. Now, since we're talking about moving files to the cloud, let's switch a little bit now and talk about storage. This new release is an open source release for the web client for AWS Transfer. What exactly am I talking about here? AWS Transfer is a series of tools that allow you to do FTP transfer of files to the cloud. Let's talk about that for a second. You have the ability to use plain FTP, which, by the way, you should not be using at all because FTP is essentially unencrypted traffic, and it's a little bit dangerous. Even if you're doing it, through a VPN, just don't do it, please. Don't use FTP. So you have two options. One is SFTP and FTPS. It sounds very similar, but they're not. One is, I believe, FTPS is essentially SSL using FTP protocol. The other one uses SSH, which is more common in a Linux environment, right? Using SSH and then putting a FTP protocol on top of that. The important thing that you need to know here, and the only thing you need to remember, is that these two tools are, enable encrypted traffic, so you're moving files in a more secure way. So just something to keep in mind there. Now, why do I need this open source software that we're talking about here? That's what we're going to get to in a second. This software is a tool that is going to allow you to move files. Right? It's really as simple as that. So at this point in time, you may be thinking, hey, why do I need this? Why can I not just use something like Dropbox or Box or my Google Drive or something like that, or the Microsoft OneDrive? You can use those tools. The problem is most companies will have policies against using these file sharing services. They will just simply not let you to use those because it's kind of a transfer of liability. So in other words, if you have company confidential data, you don't want to put that in Dropbox, because what happens if Dropbox gets hacked or they have some data leak or something like that? Your data is in their hands. That's not great from a legal point of view. So you should never be using file sharing services unless you're sure that your company, the IT department, the IT security department allows you to do something like that. So what can I do with this so-called free open source AWS Transfer family? Well, what you can do is you can set up an S3 bucket in AWS and then move data into this S3 bucket using one of the products I just mentioned from the transfer family, whether it's the FTP server or the SSH FTP as well. And you don't have to learn those protocols. You don't have to download a software that uses those protocols. What you can do is install this particular software, which is officially released by AWS, and it's free. And you can have an interface that looks exactly like Dropbox or something like that you can use. And this will be specific to your company. Nobody else would have access to it. And it's a great solution to be able to transfer files to the cloud in a secure way that is sort of proprietary to you, so nobody else will be able to access this web page because you're the one hosting the software. You can control access to it using traditional methods such as firewalls and things like that. And this would be essentially having like your own very personal Dropbox that you can only access, you and your team. So that's a solution for you to consider. And like I said, the software itself is free, and S3 is really cheap. So it's a good combination to store a large amount of data and move large amounts of data, in a cheap way. I've seen one use case for this in the past, and I'll just tell you real quick so we can move on. It was moving files, log activity files from cell phone providers, and they need all this data to make sure that the network is reliable. So they do this from several geographic locations through mobile networks, and they were using FTP to move these files. So something like this would certainly simplify the process of moving those files to the cloud. Now, going back to that Cloud Endure tool, now they're enabling enhanced monitoring. And just so you know, Cloud Endure was I think it was up to a year ago or something like that. They're an Israeli company. They developed this amazing software, and of course, AWS caught them, so they got acquired. So now it's It's a tool that's part of AWS. I believe they renamed it, so I don't think it's called Cloud Endure anymore. I think now they're calling it, data migration, something like that. So just keep that in mind. But still in the AWS documentation, it's still referred to as Cloud Endure. So I'll keep referring to it with this name. So talking about enhanced monitoring, you can use Cloud Endure together with CloudWatch now, and that allows you to generate custom metrics. Those metrics are necessary, especially if you're migrating to the cloud. Your custom applications that you need to keep track of, certain metrics such as one that's really popular is disk amount of available disk space. You will have to do something for that to capture that data and generate alarms based on that. Another one is if you're running a specific web service, you may want to measure how many orders are the customers placing, for example. That's not something you're going to find in AWS, so that will be a custom metric that you will need to measure and keep track of. And you just really need to capture the value pretty much, because once you capture the value, a tool like CloudWatch is going to allow you to set up dashboards around it. You can set up alarms. If your value is too low or your value is too high, you can set up alarms using CloudWatch for that particular information. And more specific to Cloud Endure, you can use Cloud Endure APIs to be able to tell you, hey, this migration stopped for whatever reason. Why is the migration agent not running in this machine? And you will be able to create an alarm around that using CloudWatch by accessing the Cloud Endure APIs from CloudWatch. So just know that you have that option available to you. This is more or less what that looks like. This is a simplified version of that previous diagram that we saw. So you would have your hosts, and they're connecting to a standard port to that staging replication environment that I mentioned earlier, which is an environment where you have continuous replication of the servers, and then you can choose from there whether you want to deploy them or not. Again, if you're using Cloud Endure for something like disaster recovery, you want this data replication to continue on forever and ever. And if you have a Lambda function that's accessing the Cloud Endure API, you can then, like I said, feed that data into CloudWatch, and then from there you can do anomaly detection with machine learning, you can do alarms, you can do dashboards, and all kinds of things just to be aware, if something happens to the migration process and you're no longer receiving data replication, for example. This solution is available for free, and you can pick it up from the AWS blog that is continuously updated pretty much every single day. And you can look there for Cloud Endure Enhanced Monitoring, and you can certainly find that information in there. Now let's take a look at the new AWS Backup Vault Lock feature. And in case you haven't noticed, I keep switching back and forth between storage and disaster recovery and backup. So it's great that all those little features they keep coming back, kind of like coming back around to the exact same place, because these are the tools that everybody uses when it comes to those disasters recovery and backup solutions. So in the case of the Vault Lock feature, this is one of those brand new features that's just coming out. And what we're doing here is setting up what we call a worm, or write once, read many. Essentially, the ability to create a backup. And this backup is going to go to a certain location in AWS, whether it's standard storage or cold storage or whatever you need for your application. And then it's going to have a certain retention period. This is something that is going to come up for you if you have any sort of sensitive information that you may need to meet regulatory requirements. You're going to have a retention period. So this data, I need to have this data for the sake of compliance. I need to have it for 5 years, for example. And I need to be sure that this data cannot be changed at all by anyone in my organization in the next 5 years. So you can set that up here, and from there, you will not have any issues going forward at all. There's also, I don't think it's in this screenshot, but there's some sort of grace period. I forgot the exact name. is a period of time where you're allowed to change your mind by saying, this backup, I need to update it for whatever reason or change a particular feature about this backup. And during this grace period, you'll be able to change some things. But once that period ends, it will enter the data retention period. And like I said, if you set it to 5 years or whatever, you will not be able to change or touch that data in any way for that period of time. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, it's a warm storage model, or write once, read many, meaning that you cannot change it. There is a grace period that you can set, and of course, the number one value here is the retention period, and it's usually measured in years. So people that use this feature is because they need to retain this data for regulatory reasons, and it's going to be a very, very long time. One thing to keep in mind here is that this is a new announcement. I just picked this up from the AWS blog. And if you're storing something like HIPAA or federal government data, you may not be able to use this feature just yet because it's probably not compliant at the moment. It takes a while. If you use the government cloud in AWS, for example, you realize that they're usually about 6 months behind on the latest features. The reason being is that every time a new feature comes to AWS, they need to go through that very slow certification process to be able to, pass certain government and regulatory requirements. So even though this feature is great and it's usable for this type of use cases, you might have to wait a little bit before you jump in and try to use it. Now, this one I really like because this thing has been on the news for a long, long time now, more than I would like it to be, and it's the ransomware situation. Because it keeps coming up over and over. So I was able to find some best practices that I would like to share with you today around how to mitigate ransomware. AWS has tons of white papers around this stuff, but since we are in a conversation about disaster recovery and backups, it's good to always bring this to the forefront of the conversation because ransomware is here to stay and it's going to be with us for a while. So you better be at least have some sort of plan to be able to react when something does happen. Now, the number one recommendation by AWS for this purpose is to encrypt everything. And I totally agree with this recommendation simply because if somebody's going to steal information from your environment, okay, let them steal the information. Just make sure that what they steal from you is just a bunch of garbage without the proper encryption key, right? If they cannot decrypt the information, let them have it. It's going to take them only about 80 years worth of computing time to be able to decode your information without the proper encryption key. So that's something that you need to be aware of. In this case, the service is going to be called KMS, or AWS Key Management Service. And just realize that you can provide your own keys. If you don't trust AWS themselves, you can provide your own key material. So if you have your own encryption software or something like that, you can certainly use that. And AWS, like I said, they recommend this as the number one practice against ransomware, which is, there's a little bit of irony there because ransomware attacks is essentially an encryption attack. But if the data is already encrypted, you can tell, you go ahead and steal it. We're not going to pay the ransom. So, you just be sure to use KMS for all of the AWS services that you may have. In particular, for this conversation, we're talking about storage, so you would encrypt your backups and your AWS S3 storage backups. Let's see, what else do we have? Another one is, we're going back to the same. We're going back to Cloud Endure. In this case, what we're doing Cloud Endure for is in the context of ransomware. So what you would do is, our servers got hacked. So we don't understand exactly what happened with the servers. Because Cloud Endure is by definition a sort of a gap data recovery, meaning that your source is either in your building physically or is in a different region in AWS, And either way, the servers are not going to be side by side. They're going to be geographically apart, okay? So in this context, what you would do is, okay, we just got hacked. Let's go ahead and destroy the entire environment, destroy everything, change the password, and then go to Cloud Endure to our point of reference, and then do a disaster recovery from there. So in this case, like I said, the key factor is to have a gap between the environment that got hacked and the environment that has the disaster recovery architecture. So if you're in the cloud, for example, you may have your servers in production running on the West Coast and your disaster recovery set out for the East Coast, right? So in that case, you would say, okay, we got attacked by ransomware. We're going to intentionally destroy the servers on the West Coast, and we're going to switch to our disaster recovery environment in the East Coast, all within AWS. Of course, this is assuming that the hacker only had access to one of those environments, right? You want to, hopefully they don't have access to both in this particular case. So yeah, this is something that you want to, I totally agree with this recommendation, and it's something that you want to consider. This is probably the fastest way to recover an environment, and not only that, because of the staging architecture that Cloud Endure offers, you have the ability to actually test this. You can say, okay, twice a year, we're going to simulate that we're getting a ransomware attack. We're actually going to do this in the staging environment. And that brings me to tell you you really don't have a disaster recovery plan unless you actually test it. So yeah, if you can test your disaster recovery plan a couple times a year, at least once a year, to be sure that it works and that you're secure at that when it finally happens. The other recommendation that AWS has for ransomware is to always be aware of critical patches and apply them as soon as possible. In this architecture that we're looking at, they recommend the use of SSM, which is the AWS Systems Manager. It's essentially a tool that you deploy in your servers. And if you ever use a tool like Ansible or Chef or Puppet, this will be very familiar to you. The goal here is to be able to send a script to all your servers, and this script is going to allow you to deploy stuff on those servers all at once without you having to manually log into every single one to deploy the software. In this case, we're talking about deploying security patches. That's very common in the Linux environment. Windows is a little bit slower when it comes to updates and emergency releases. But they do occur as well, and you need to be prepared to apply those patches to your environment for security's sake. And the way to do it is, looking at this architecture, is by using the SSM, or Systems Manager, which is essentially a tool that is going to say, okay, we have this file in this S3 bucket, and this is the latest patch for the operating system, and we want our servers to go to this bucket, download this file, and install the patch. This is something that you can certainly do. Just be aware that for any and all of this stuff to work, you would need ahead of time to have the SSM agent installed in your machines. And by the way, if you need to connect to your servers manually for whatever reason, the SSM service also provides connectivity into your service, into your servers. And this is something that I use all the time because it allows you to connect to your servers without having to use username or passwords, which we know by definition are pretty weak most of the time. And also, you don't need SSH keys, which is also something that you can misplace, and things happen, right? So in this way, you can only access your servers directly from the AWS console using the SSM Manager. So something to keep in mind. So if you deploy new servers in AWS, you can use something like this. Another recommendation AWS has for ransomware reason is to use Security Hub. And I also totally agree with this because this is a tool I use all the time. It essentially provides you with a score, right? It will look for everything that's going on in your environment, such as, hey, do you have a public-facing IP? Do you have ports that are open? Is this password protected? All those little things. And it will give you a security score. And this is really great because it kind of gamifies the process of securing your environment. So with this information in hand, you can go right ahead and say, well, I want to be able to log in to my environment and find all the weaknesses today, and I'm going to start reacting to these weaknesses in a positive way, right? You'll never get, I'll let you know right now, you will never get to the 100% security score because let's say, for example, you have a public-facing web server. Well, that's not going to change. You're not going to lock it down because you need it so the public can access this particular machine. So that will lower your score, but like I said, there's nothing you can do about it other than perhaps ignore that recommendation in the security hub. But that's what it does. It's a hub, meaning that if you have multiple AWS accounts, you can monitor everything from this one single location, and it will keep track of pretty much everything that's going on in your environment, whether it's network traffic, which you can do with guard duty, for example. You can monitor change activity using something like AWS config. And all those findings will be in this one screen that you can use in the AWS Security Hub dashboard. So the most useful part of this tool is that, like I said, if you have multiple environments, like development accounts and production accounts, and you can monitor everything from a single location, which is great if you have a dedicated security officer or security team that's just designed to follow up on these particular tasks. And they also provide a collection of rules. So if you need to be PCI compliant, if you need to be, FedRAMP compliant, if you need one of those compliance frameworks, you can just monitor all those things from here. Let's say, for example, that somebody forgot to encrypt a drive or a Windows machine. You can monitor that from here, from a single location, without having to go anywhere else. Another thing is that you can do in the sake of mitigation, back to our ransomware conversation, is to enable monitoring and alarms. In this case, I'm talking about things like unusual activity. Let's say, for example, something like cryptocurrency mining will trigger a high CPU usage, for example. And that's something you can generate an alarm or even set up a machine learning anomaly detection. So if your servers are usually around, 40% CPU usage when they're at work, if you all of a sudden you see 80% activity or 90% activity in your CPU and it's constant, it's just hitting there all the time, then you know that something's going on, right? And you can set up an alarm that will send you a text message or an email using the simple notification service by AWS. So just something to keep in mind. You can also enable automated response to those incidents, but you're not going to get into that conversation because that falls outside of AWS, and you're going to need third-party tools that know how to react to certain network activity, for example. Like let's say that it's beyond the firewall. Let's say that it's inside your virtual private cloud, and you have some unusual network traffic, high bandwidth or something like that. You may want to have a software that knows how to react to these events and go from there. Now, everything I just mentioned, you can find the specific implementations details in the AWS security blogs, where you can find here in this URL, which is amazon.com/blog/security. And you can search for ransomware mitigation, and that's going to lead you to the white paper that I went through and documents that I went through to get this particular part of the presentation for you. So it's a fascinating topic, and I would encourage you to go and check it out just for the sake to see how close you are to complying with these things, because it's just something that you need to be aware of, because this thing could happen to any of us at any time, so it's good to be aware of this. Now, this service is not very, very common. It's not mentioned most of the time, but I really like it. It's essentially an AWS tool called Amazon Massey, and it's designed to find sensitive data in a database or some other type of documents. I mentioned a particular database here because some people will use Amazon Massey to go through text files, but they forget that their databases may contain sensitive information. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you just want to make sure that the data that you have in there is where it's supposed to be. Let's say, for example, you have a database in a development environment. You may not want to have real data or sensitive data in a development environment. You may want to change social security numbers into 999 or something like that, something fake, right? You may not want to have real data in your development environment. So this particular implementation of Amazon Massey will help you with that. Let's get into it. So the way that it works most of the times is you would run this tool against an S3 bucket, and this S3 bucket is going to contain particular information, like something that you just got from a database or something like that. And then it's going to be searched and analyzed by Amazon Massey, which it has a lot of patterns to look for data. So it knows what a social security number looks like. It knows what a credit card number looks like. And it will alert you based on this information being there. And again, if it's a production database and that's where the information is supposed to be, then that's fine. You don't need to take any action. However, if you have this data in a lower environment, such as tests or development, you may want to take certain actions, such as, obfuscate that data or just delete it altogether. All right, let's take a look at the actual architecture. And again, this comes from that security blog that I just mentioned. So you can get this from there. So the first thing is, number one here, we have our database service that contains the data we're talking about. And then we run it through an AWS data migration service. And then through this service, we're going to dump the data into the destination bucket that Amazon Massey is going to be monitoring. Now, once this data is here, we can have a trigger that's going to start an Amazon Massey job on this data. And then from there, we can use something like Amazon Event Bridge to monitor events such as completion of the job, or the job being stopped for whatever reason, or when the job starts, if we need to send notifications or something like that. Then we can send that data for analysis, whatever the results may be, and perhaps run it through an ETL, as I mentioned, extract, transform, and load. And what that's going to do is, like I said, if you wanted to obfuscate the data or delete it altogether, you can certainly do that. Once that data has been analyzed, you can send it to something like an Amazon Athena bucket, which is going to allow you to run SQL queries or similar, on top of your overall analysis, right? Because remember, if you're looking for something, you need to be prepared whether you're going to find it or not. You need to have tools that are going to help you decide whether you need to take actions or not. So just don't assume that it's always going to be clear, meaning no data, or full of data. So you have to have be able to take actions either way, right? And the analysis here concludes with Amazon Athena, which is, like I said, is a dashboard where you can see the results from the analysis. So just wanted to make sure that you are aware of this type of use of Amazon Massey, not just for text files, but also use it for databases. Now, another one that is, I believe, is underrated, and this is probably one of the most underrated ones. This is a really, really great tool. It's Amazon Guard Duty. It's something that you want to use for detecting threats in your environment. And by the way, I believe this one is part of the Security Hub, meaning that if you enable Security Hub in your environment, you will already be automatically enabling Guard Duty behind the scenes. So just be aware of that, and I wanted to bring it up since we're talking about data protection and security here, so this is a really great tool in that sense. So what does it do? This tool, you enable it pretty quickly and easily, and it's a tool that is designed to just look at your DNS logs or your network flow logs, at your CloudTrail events, for example. And it's going to look for anything that looks unusual there. So what is considered unusual? Well, in a DNS log, you may have a ton of queries from a single location. That's usually a denial of service attack. On a flow log, you may have certain robots trying to hit your server over and over again, or doing some port scanning on your servers. those are considered dangerous activities or unusual activities, and they should trigger an alarm within guard duty. Now, once those findings are detected, of course, it's really up to you what you want to see happen from there, such as prevention or remediation. And in that case, that it could be as simple as sending an alert to an operator to go in there and have a look. This is more or less what that would look like in this type of architecture. You will have guard duty, and as I mentioned, it's part of Security Hub. So if you enable Security Hub, you're already getting guard duty behind the scenes. And you can use that in conjunction with Event Bridge, and Event Bridge will let you know, hey, guard duty is saying something. Maybe it's time to trigger, some kind of event, right? And this one in particular, this is an architecture that they provide that allows you to take automated action. So Event Bridge will tell you, hey, this IP is bothering our network. It's trying to do something. And you can use that information to create a firewall rule. So essentially, you can, without having to wake anybody up in the middle of the night, you can create a rule, and this rule is going to block traffic coming from that IP address or that particular IP range, and then your system will continue to run normally without any human intervention. So this is really great use of guard duty. Granted, of course, this is not like super easy to implement. This takes a little bit of effort to do this particular implementation that you're looking at, and you may even end up blocking authentic traffic, like some of your users or whatever. But again, there are some applications that you cannot afford to have shut down for whatever reason. So a level of protection like this may be necessary, especially if you have web servers that are constantly exposed to denial of service attack, for example. So again, I got this architecture from the security blog on AWS. It's not super easy to implement, so like I said, you may need to dedicate some time if you wanted to implement a solution like this, but it's a great use of an underrated tool such as guard duty. So, and with that, I'll be more than happy to take your questions. This is a never-ending conversation around what's new and what's hot. There's always going to be something there, especially coming up with reInvent in the next 4 or 5 weeks. So there's certainly a lot more to talk about when it comes to new features and hot features in AWS. So, David, you have questions for us?
We certainly do, Carlos. Good stuff.
Awesome.
And I would like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's get right to them. Let's start off with a real easy one for you, Carlos, from Thomas. He asks, is AWS Key Management Service accredited for use in government DoD systems?
I would say yes to that. Usually it's based on the age of the service. As I mentioned, if a new feature comes around right now, it will take maybe up to 6 months to become available and certified in all those certifications, whether it's FedRAMP or HIPAA or all that stuff. But KMS has been around for quite a while, and I have to say, yes, it is fully ready for government use.
Yes, I actually looked it up on the AWS site, and there's a little section that says how AWS KMS differs for AWS GovCloud. It says this service has no differences between AWS GovCloud, U.S. regions, and the standard AWS regions.
Right.
Okay, next question comes from Nabil. Can you perform backups of networking equipment like switches and routers, more specifically Cisco or Meraki?
My answer to that is going to be yes. Most of the devices are available in a virtualized form. So especially something like a Palo Alto, you can get it fully virtualized, or a Cisco ANA or something like that. You can have them virtualized and running in AWS. And yes, you can create those snapshots of those machines. So in case something happens, they get breached or whatever, you can shut them down and get those snapshots and restart them from your latest backup. So yeah, that's certainly yes for me.
Okay, and you talked quite a bit about Cloud Endure, and this question might have been sent in early in your presentation before you addressed it, but the question is Cloud Endure free to use?
Interesting. The answer is both yes and no. If you're trying to do a data migration, I believe they will give you like 90 days so that you can complete a data migration absolutely for free, which is not really a big deal because they even tell you that if you want more time, you can just renew the license for free and get another free 90 days. So no problem there. However, if you need 24 hours replication, as in using Cloud Endure for disaster recovery, as I mentioned in this presentation, yes, there is a cost per hour. It's really below, fractions of a penny, but just something to keep in mind. This for the sake of running it 24/7 for disaster recovery is not free.
Okay. And Brian sent in not a question, but an observation that I'll just throw out there for your comment. Brian says, save the config files offline also.
Yeah, I love that comment because I worked in telecom for a number of years. So yeah, you can just do an export of the router configuration file. And yes, once you have it in a secure location, say an S3 bucket or offline, as mentioned, if something happens, you can just do a fresh factory restart from a trusted source, and then just pull in your config, and then you're off to the races again. Great advice.
Okay. Great. Next question reads, can I secure backups in AWS without using the AWS backup service?
Absolutely. Yes, because you can configure S3 buckets with several things. Number one, you can do an S3 bucket and just encrypt everything pretty much and limit access to it to certain admin users. So that kind of becomes like a manual use of data protection there. Another thing is you can set it up as a gap measure, set up an S3 bucket in a different region, in a different country, if your regulations allow you to do that, and then have that data there so that, if your environment gets hacked, you have that extra protection. So you can certainly do it manually like that and also cheaper. Even AWS Glacier Vault allows you to lock data for retention and regulatory reasons, so you can do that as well without using AWS backup.
Okay. The next question is about FTP. What's a good use case for FTP? Shouldn't it be obsolete by now?
I totally agree. FTP should be outlawed by now. There's really not much use for it. But yeah, there are certain situations where you need an automated way to pass files from point A to point B, and using a standard protocol like FTP can certainly help, especially for legacy reasons. If you're interfacing with a machine that's really old, yeah, you can certainly use FTP to transfer data in that way. Like I said, mostly for legacy reasons, if you're doing this in modern day and age, you can use AWS APIs directly to transfer files. But yeah, FTP, I suspect, is going to be around for a few more years.
Okay, next question. Can I use, let's go to, how can I set up an active disaster recovery scenario using Route 53?
Well, that's a great question. Route 53 provides what is known as health checks. So if you have two environments, as I mentioned, let's say that you have a West Coast environment and an East Coast environment, Route 53 using health checks can determine if one of those environments goes offline and then make a decision on its own to send your traffic to the other, to the disaster recovery site. So yeah, the answer to that would be by using Route 53 DNS health checks.
Okay, the next question reads, are these new features available in GovCloud for companies in the public sector?
Yes, most of the time it's yes, but the problem is if something is brand new, there will be a waiting period, while those new features get certified by the auditing agencies. So while that time is going, yes, you may not be able to have access to certain brand new features. It happens to me all the time when I'm doing something for a commercial customer, and then I switch to GovCloud to work in the public sector, and then, I can't use this feature because it's not available yet. But just hang tight. It's just usually a matter of a month, and then done.
All right, let's squeeze in one last question. What's the difference between access control and security groups?
Network access controls essentially is what you would want to use if you're trying to block entire subnets from hitting your network, or should be the other way around, allowing a certain block to access your network. But if you're under a denial of service attack, for example, you want to block a certain IP range. It usually comes in groups from a certain location, so you can block an entire IP range using something like a network access control. Now, security groups is more specific, and I use it as a deny by default. Let's say that I want to control SSH access or remote desktop access to a machine. I would just allow one or two specific IPs to get in there and then deny everybody else. That's the kind of like the way I use those together. So NACLs for blocking everybody, and security groups really for allowing people in, if you will.
Okay, good answer. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks again, Carlos, for an excellent presentation and answering those questions.